The old woman's voice trembled as she stood near the steps of a small, quiet church. "I just need someone at the funeral." Her hands were shaking. She was 91 years old. The wind moved slowly through the empty parking lot, carrying dry leaves across the pavement. The church doors were open, but inside there was only silence. No cars. No visitors. No family members arriving with flowers. Just an elderly woman standing alone beside a wooden bench, holding a folded piece of paper in her fragile hands. Across the street, a man had just stepped out of a small coffee shop. It was Keanu Reeves. He wasn't surrounded by cameras. No bodyguards. No fancy car waiting nearby. Just a quiet morning, a cup of coffee in his hand, and a moment he never expected to witness. As he walked past the church, he heard something that made him slow down. Soft crying. At first, he thought it was the wind. But then he heard the voice again. "I just need someone to stand there, so he isn't alone." Keanu turned toward the church steps. The elderly woman wiped her eyes quickly, as if she didn't want anyone to see her crying. But it was too late. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Keanu walked closer, his footsteps slow and careful. "Ma'am," he said gently, "are you okay?" The woman tried to smile, but her lips trembled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean to bother anyone." Keanu shook his head. "You're not bothering me." She looked down at the paper in her hands. It was a funeral notice. "My husband," she said quietly. Her voice cracked. "He's being buried today." Keanu glanced toward the empty parking lot again. Still no cars. Still no people arriving. Just silence. The woman took a deep breath. "We were married for 67 years, she continued. "All our friends are gone now, and our family lives far away." Another tear rolled down her cheek. "I thought maybe someone would come." But no one had. Not a single person. She looked up at Keanu with tired eyes. "I don't want him to be buried alone." Her voice broke again. "So I was just hoping." She hesitated before finishing the sentence. "Hoping someone would stand there with me." Keanu looked at the church. Then back at the fragile woman standing in front of him. What happened next would bring more than 200 unexpected people to that quiet funeral. And it would become a moment no one there would ever forget. The cold morning air lingered around the small church as the elderly woman stood beside Keanu Reeves, still holding the folded funeral notice in her hands. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The parking lot remained completely empty. No cars pulling in. No footsteps approaching the church doors. Just silence. The woman finally took a slow breath. "My name is Margaret," she said softly. Keanu nodded politely. "It's nice to meet you, Margaret." She looked toward the open church doors again, almost as if she was still hoping someone might appear. But no one did. Margaret slowly sat down on the wooden bench near the steps. Her movements were careful and fragile, like someone carrying the weight of many years. Keanu sat beside her. "My husband's name was Daniel," she began. Her eyes drifted toward the sky as if searching through memories. "We met when I was 22. A small smile appeared on her face. "He used to ride a motorcycle when he was young. Thought he looked very tough." She chuckled quietly through the sadness. "But he wasn't tough at all. He was the kindest man I ever knew." Keanu listened without interrupting. For Margaret, it felt like the first time someone had truly listened in a long time. "We were married for 67 years, she continued. "We traveled when we were younger. Had neighbors who came for dinner every Sunday. Our house was always full of people." Her smile slowly faded. "But time changes everything." One by one, the people they loved began to disappear. Friends passed away. Neighbors moved away. Their children grew up and built lives far from the small town. Daniel's health began to decline 2 years earlier. Margaret took care of him every single day. Doctor's visits. Medicine. Long nights sitting beside his bed while he slept. "I promised him I would never leave him alone," she said quietly. 3 days ago, Daniel had passed away peacefully in his sleep. Margaret was the only person sitting beside him. The funeral director had tried to be gentle when explaining the situation. "Mrs. Wilson," he said carefully, "sometimes smaller funerals happen when families live far away." But Margaret knew what he meant. There might be very few people attending. Still, she believed someone would come. Maybe an old neighbor. Maybe someone Daniel once worked with. Maybe anyone who remembered him. But that morning, when she arrived at the church, the parking lot was empty. And it had stayed that way. Margaret lowered her head. "I wasn't asking for a crowd," she whispered. "I just didn't want him to be alone." Keanu looked at the small piece of paper in her hands. It listed the funeral time, the location, and Daniel Wilson's name. A simple life summarized in a few lines. Keanu slowly stood up and looked around the quiet street. The town was peaceful. Too peaceful. Margaret noticed him pulling his phone out of his jacket pocket. "You don't have to stay," she said gently. "You've already been very kind." Keanu looked at her and shook his head. No one should face a moment like this alone. He typed a short message. Just a few words. Then he pressed send. Margaret didn't know who he contacted. But somewhere far down the highway, dozens of motorcycles suddenly changed direction. Within minutes, the distant sound of engines began to echo through the quiet streets. At first, Margaret thought it was thunder. But the sound kept growing louder. And louder. Keanu looked down the road calmly. Because he knew something Margaret didn't. In less than 20 minutes, more than 200 riders would arrive at that empty funeral. And the lonely goodbye Margaret feared would turn into something unforgettable. The sound started as a faint vibration in the distance. At first, Margaret didn't even notice it. She was still staring at the folded funeral notice in her hands, her fingers gently tracing the letters of her husband's name. Daniel Wilson. 67 years of memories reduced to a few printed words. Beside her, Keanu Reeves stood quietly near the church steps, looking down the empty road. The sound grew louder. A low rumble. Deep. Steady. Margaret slowly lifted her head. "Do you hear that?" she asked softly. Keanu nodded. "Yes." The rumbling grew stronger, echoing between the buildings on the quiet street. It didn't sound like a single motorcycle. It sounded like many. Margaret turned toward the road, confusion spreading across her face. "Is there some kind of parade today?" she wondered. Keanu didn't answer right away. He simply watched the distant highway. The sound of engines rolled closer, like thunder moving across the sky. Inside the church, the funeral director stepped outside, adjusting his jacket nervously. He had heard the noise too. "What on earth?" he murmured. Then the first motorcycle appeared at the end of the street. A large black bike turned the corner slowly. The rider wore a leather jacket and dark boots. Behind him came another motorcycle. And another. And another. Within seconds, the quiet street was filled with a deep roar of engines. Margaret's eyes widened. Motorcycles lined the road, stretching farther than she could see. Dozens of them. Maybe more. The riders moved slowly and carefully, forming a long line along the church parking lot. People from nearby shops stepped outside to watch. A bakery owner stood in the doorway, wiping flour from his hands. A young couple stopped walking their dog. Everyone stared in shock. Because this wasn't just a group of riders passing through. They were stopping. Right there. At the church. Margaret's voice trembled again. "Why are they coming here?" Keanu looked calm. Almost thoughtful. One by one, the motorcycles rolled into the parking lot and turned off their engines. The sudden silence felt even louder than the rumbling had been. Riders removed their helmets. Serious faces. Weathered expressions. Leather jackets marked with large patches on the back. The funeral director swallowed nervously. He recognized the symbol immediately. Across the back of those jackets were 3 words. Hell's Angels. More than 100 riders were now standing near the church. And they were still arriving. Margaret gripped the edge of the bench beside her. Her heart was racing. "I don't understand," she whispered. One of the bikers, a tall man with gray in his beard, walked slowly toward the church steps. His heavy boots echoed softly against the pavement. Behind him, The other riders stood quietly beside their motorcycles. Not talking. Not laughing. Just waiting. The man stopped a few feet away from Margaret and Keanu. For a moment, he looked at the elderly woman with gentle curiosity. Then he glanced toward Keanu. Recognition passed between them. A small nod. Nothing more. Then the biker spoke. "We heard someone needed people at a funeral." Margaret blinked in disbelief. Her hands trembled again. "But, you don't even know us." The man's expression softened. He looked toward the open church doors. Then back at Margaret. "No one should leave this world alone." Behind him, the line of riders continued to grow. More motorcycles turned into the parking lot. More boots touched the ground. Margaret slowly covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed by what she was seeing. Just 20 minutes ago, the funeral had been completely empty. Now more than 200 strangers had come to stand beside her. And the service hadn't even started yet. For several seconds, Margaret could only stare. The church parking lot that had been empty just moments ago was now filled with motorcycles. Row after row of powerful bikes stood quietly in the cold morning air. Chrome reflected the sunlight. Leather jackets rustled softly as riders stepped away from their machines. More engines could still be heard in the distance. They were still coming. Margaret's heart raced as she looked at the men and women gathering near the church steps. Some were tall and broad-shouldered. Others older, with gray beards and lined faces that told stories of long roads and harder lives. But every single one of them moved calmly, respectfully. There was no shouting, no loud laughter, only quiet footsteps and serious expressions. The tall biker who had spoken earlier turned back toward the road and lifted a hand. Within seconds, the remaining riders parked their motorcycles and shut off their engines. The powerful roar that had filled the street disappeared. Suddenly, the entire area fell into a deep, respectful silence. Margaret looked at Keanu Reeves, still trying to understand what was happening. "Did you call them?" she asked gently. Keanu gave a small smile. "I only sent one message." Margaret blinked in confusion. One message brought all these people? Keanu didn't answer. Because at that moment, the tall biker stepped forward again. He removed his gloves slowly and approached Margaret with careful steps. Up close, his expression looked much kinder than his tough appearance suggested. He knelt slightly so his eyes were level with hers. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "we heard someone here needed people to stand at a funeral." Margaret's voice trembled. "But you don't even know my husband." The biker shook his head. "No," he admitted. "But that doesn't matter." Behind him, more than 200 riders were now standing quietly in front of the church. Some had removed their helmets and held them respectfully against their sides. Others folded their hands in front of them. A few looked toward the church doors. But no one spoke. The funeral director stepped forward nervously, unsure what to do. He had never seen anything like this before. At first, he had been afraid. But now something else filled the air. Respect. Real, undeniable respect. Margaret slowly stood up from the bench, her legs trembling slightly. One of the bikers immediately stepped forward to steady her arm. "Careful, ma'am," he said softly. Margaret looked around at the sea of leather jackets and motorcycles. Tears began to fill her eyes again. "Daniel would have never believed this," she whispered. The tall biker smiled faintly. "Sounds like he was the kind of man worth showing up for." Keanu watched quietly as the moment unfolded. He hadn't planned for attention. He hadn't planned for recognition. He had simply refused to let a man be buried alone. The church bell rang once. Its soft echo drifted across the street. The funeral director cleared his throat. I think the service should begin," he said. The tall biker turned toward the other riders and gave a simple nod. Immediately, the crowd began moving toward the church. But not in a rush. They walked slowly, quietly, respectfully. The church that had felt empty just half an hour earlier now filled with people. Large bikers carefully removed their hats before entering. Some bowed their heads as they stepped inside. Others paused at the door as if silently paying their respects. Margaret stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by what she was seeing. Her husband had feared being forgotten. But now hundreds of strangers were walking through those doors for him. One biker gently offered Margaret his arm. "Would you like help walking inside?" She nodded, unable to speak. As they slowly walked toward the church entrance, Margaret glanced back at Keanu. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly. Keanu shook his head. "I didn't do this." He gestured toward the riders filling the church. "They chose to come." Margaret wiped a tear from her cheek. "Still," she whispered, "you made sure he wasn't alone." Inside the church, the wooden pews quickly filled. Leather jackets sat beside worn hymn books. Heavy boots rested quietly on the old wooden floor. Outside, motorcycles lined the street like a long silver river stretching into the distance. The quiet town had never seen anything like it. And the funeral that was supposed to be empty had just become one of the most unforgettable goodbyes anyone there had ever witnessed. The church had never been this full before. Rows of wooden pews that were meant for a small local service were now filled with large men and women wearing worn leather jackets. Heavy boots rested quietly against the wooden floor. Helmets were placed respectfully beside them. And despite their intimidating appearance, the entire room was silent. Not a whisper. Not a phone ringing. Not even the sound of someone shifting in their seat. Everyone sat with the same calm respect. At the front of the church stood a simple wooden coffin. Inside rested Daniel Wilson, the man Margaret had loved for 67 years. Only an hour earlier, Margaret believed almost no one would come to say goodbye. Now more than 200 strangers had gathered in that small church. And every one of them had come for the same reason: to make sure Daniel would not be buried alone. Margaret slowly walked down the aisle with the help of one of the bikers who had offered her his arm. Her steps were slow but steady. As she passed each row, something remarkable happened. Every single rider stood up. One by one. Row after row. The quiet movement filled the church like a silent wave of respect. Margaret's hands trembled as she looked around. She had never seen anything like this in her life. These were people she had never met. People her husband had never met. Yet they were standing for him as if they had known him for years. When Margaret finally reached the front of the church, she gently placed her hand on the coffin. Her fingers rested softly on the polished wood. "Daniel," she whispered. Her voice was barely louder than the wind outside. "I told you someone would come." Tears rolled down her face. Behind her, the riders slowly sat down again. The funeral director stepped forward nervously. He cleared his throat and opened the small book in his hands. "Today we gather," he began quietly, "to honor the life of Daniel Wilson." His voice echoed through the church. But as he spoke, many of the riders listened with a seriousness that surprised anyone who might have judged them by appearance. Some bowed their heads. Others folded their hands together. One older biker wiped his eyes quietly with a handkerchief. Because something about this moment felt deeply human. It didn't matter that they had never known Daniel. It didn't matter that they had only heard about this funeral less than an hour ago. They understood something simple. No person should leave this world alone. When the funeral director finished speaking, he looked toward Margaret. "Would you like to say something about your husband?" he asked gently. Margaret hesitated. She had planned to say only a few words earlier that morning, back when she thought she would be standing in front of an almost empty room. But now she looked out at the crowd filling the church. More than 200 faces watching her quietly. Waiting. Listening. Her voice shook as she began. "Daniel was not a famous man," she said softly. "He didn't have a lot of money." A few riders nodded quietly. "But he had something far more important," she continued. "He had kindness." She paused, trying to steady her voice. "My husband believed that how you treat people matters more than anything else." Margaret looked around the room again. "And today, all of you proved he was right." Several riders lowered their heads. Because those words carried weight. Margaret wiped her tears and smiled gently. "When we were young," she continued, "Daniel used to ride a motorcycle. He loved the freedom of the road." A few bikers exchanged quiet smiles. He said the sound of an engine meant adventure. The tall biker with a gray beard, who had spoken outside earlier, nodded slightly. Margaret looked down at the coffin. "I think he would have loved seeing all of you here." A soft silence followed. Then something unexpected happened. The tall biker slowly stood up from his seat. Everyone in the church turned toward him. He walked toward the front of the room and stopped beside Margaret. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, "my name is Frank." Margaret looked at him with gentle curiosity. Frank took a deep breath. "We've been writing for a lot of years," he said. "We've seen good days and bad ones." He glanced back at the writers filling the pews. "But one thing we believe in is brotherhood." He turned back toward Margaret. "And today, your husband is part of that." Margaret's eyes filled with tears again. Frank placed his hand respectfully over his heart. "Daniel Wilson will not ride alone today." Behind him, the sound of boots touching the floor echoed as every biker in the church stood up again. 200 people standing together in silence. Margaret covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Because in that moment, something incredible had happened. Her husband had arrived at the church with no one waiting. But he would leave surrounded by an entire family of strangers who had come together for one simple reason: respect. The silence inside the church felt powerful. More than 200 bikers were standing together, their heads slightly bowed. The wooden floor creaked softly under the weight of their heavy boots, but no one moved. At the front of the room, Margaret stood beside the coffin, her hand resting gently on the polished wood. Her eyes were filled with tears, but this time they were not tears of loneliness. They were tears of gratitude. Just an hour earlier, she had believed she would be saying goodbye to her husband alone. Now the church was filled with people honoring a man they had never met. The tall biker named Frank slowly stepped back to his place among the riders. Before sitting down, he turned toward the coffin and gave a small, respectful nod. One by one, the rest of the bikers did the same. Some placed a hand over their hearts. Others lowered their heads for a moment of silence. The funeral director cleared his throat gently. "We will now prepare for the final procession," he announced quietly. Margaret took a deep breath. The moment she had been dreading all morning had finally arrived. The final goodbye. 2 funeral attendants carefully stepped forward and lifted the coffin. As they did, something remarkable happened again. Every single biker in the church stepped aside, forming a wide path down the aisle. A long corridor of leather jackets and silent respect stretched from the front of the church all the way to the doors. Margaret slowly followed behind the coffin. The biker who had helped her earlier offered his arm again. She held it gratefully as they walked forward. As Margaret passed each rider, many of them lowered their heads in quiet respect. Some whispered soft condolences. Others simply nodded gently. But every single person acknowledged her loss. Outside, the sky had grown slightly darker. Clouds drifted slowly across the afternoon sun. The long line of motorcycles waited in perfect rows across the parking lot. People from nearby buildings had gathered along the sidewalks to watch. Word had spread quickly through the small town. No one had ever seen so many bikers gathered for a funeral before. The church doors opened. The coffin was carried outside. The cool wind moved softly across the parking lot as the riders followed in silence. Margaret stepped out slowly behind them. When she saw the full line of motorcycles stretching down the street, she stopped for a moment in disbelief. The bikes formed a powerful procession. Chrome shining. Engines waiting quietly. More than 200 riders standing beside them. Frank stepped forward again. He looked toward the riders and lifted his hand slightly. Within seconds, every biker moved into position beside their motorcycle. Helmets were placed on heads. Gloves pulled tight. The sound of engines had not started yet. But the energy in the air felt powerful. Frank walked toward Margaret once more. "Ma'am," he said gently, "if it's all right with you, we'd like to escort your husband." Margaret blinked in surprise. "Escort him?" Frank nodded. "All the way to the cemetery." Margaret looked down at the coffin, then back at the endless row of motorcycles. Her voice trembled. "He would have loved that." Frank smiled slightly. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." He turned back toward the riders and raised his hand again. Suddenly, more than 200 motorcycle engines started at the same time. The deep thunder rolled through the street like a wave. People watching from nearby shops gasped at the powerful sound. But the riders kept their engines steady and controlled. Not loud for attention. Just strong enough to be heard. Margaret placed her hand over her heart. The sound filled the air like a final salute. Keanu Reeves stood quietly nearby, watching the moment unfold. He hadn't asked for recognition. He hadn't expected anything like this. All he had done was send a simple message asking if anyone could help. But the riders had turned that small request into something unforgettable. The funeral car slowly pulled forward with Daniel's coffin inside. Frank lifted his hand again. The motorcycles formed a long line behind the car. Row after row of riders preparing to escort a man they had never met. Margaret watched in amazement as the procession began to move. 200 motorcycles following behind the hearse. A river of chrome and leather stretching down the road. People along the sidewalks removed their hats. Some held their hands over their hearts. Others simply stood quietly, watching the powerful moment pass. Margaret turned toward Keanu, her voice barely above a whisper. "I asked for one person," she said softly. Her eyes filled with tears again. "But you gave him an army." Keanu shook his head gently. "No," he replied. "They chose to come." Margaret looked back at the endless line of motorcycles escorting her husband down the road. For the first time since Daniel had passed away, she no longer felt alone. And neither did he. The long line of motorcycles moved slowly through the quiet streets of the town. At the front of the procession, the funeral car carried Daniel Wilson's coffin. Behind it stretched something no one could have imagined earlier that morning. More than 200 motorcycles riding together. Engines rumbling in deep, steady harmony. The sound echoed between buildings and drifted across the quiet neighborhoods as the procession passed. People stepped outside their homes. Shop owners stood in their doorways. Drivers on the road pulled their cars to the side and watched silently. Many had never seen anything like it. A massive group of bikers escorting a funeral. But there was something different about this moment. No one was racing their engines. No one was shouting. Every rider moved slowly and carefully, maintaining a respectful distance behind the hearse. It wasn't a show. It was a tribute. Inside the car behind the hearse, Margaret sat quietly with her hands folded in her lap. Her eyes were still red from crying. But the sadness she had felt earlier that morning had changed into something else. Something warmer. Something peaceful. She looked out the window at the endless line of motorcycles following them. The riders were strangers. People who had never known her husband. Yet they had come together to make sure his final journey would not be lonely. Margaret whispered softly, "Daniel, you always believed people were good." The car turned onto a small road leading toward the town cemetery. Tall trees lined the path, their branches moving gently in the wind. At the entrance to the cemetery, the funeral car slowed to a stop. The motorcycles behind it gradually pulled to the side, forming two long lines on both sides of the road. Engines turned off one by one. The powerful rumbling slowly faded into silence. Riders stepped off their bikes. Helmets removed. Boots touching the gravel path. Soon, the cemetery was filled with quiet figures standing respectfully beneath the trees. The coffin was carefully lifted from the hearse. Four attendants carried it toward the burial site. Margaret followed slowly behind them. This time, she didn't walk alone. On both sides of the path, the bikers stood shoulder to shoulder, forming another long corridor of respect. Some bowed their heads as she passed. Others placed their hands over their hearts. A few quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Margaret reached the grave and stood beside the coffin one final time. The priest began the last prayer. His calm voice drifted gently through the cool afternoon air. "Today we say goodbye to a man who lived a life of quiet kindness." The words felt simple, but they carried meaning. When the prayer ended, the priest nodded respectfully toward Margaret. "If you would like to say a final word," he said softly. Margaret stepped forward slowly. For a moment, she simply looked around at the crowd surrounding her. Hundreds of people standing among the trees. People who had arrived that morning because of a single message. Her voice trembled as she began. My husband believed that kindness was the most important thing a person could give to the world. She paused and looked down at the coffin. He wasn't famous. He wasn't rich. But he always helped people whenever he could. Margaret looked back toward the riders. And today, all of you showed the same kindness to him. Her voice broke again. But you didn't just honor my husband. You saved me from the loneliest moment of my life. The riders remained silent, listening carefully. Margaret wiped her tears gently. When I arrived at the church this morning, she continued, I believed no one would come. She glanced toward Keanu Reeves, who stood quietly near the back of the group. But one person stopped to listen. She smiled softly. And that one moment changed everything. Several riders turned their heads slightly toward Keanu. But he simply stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, avoiding attention. Margaret took a deep breath. My husband once told me something many years ago. She looked back down at the coffin. He said that sometimes the people who show the greatest kindness are complete strangers. Margaret slowly raised her head again. Today you proved he was right. For a few seconds, the cemetery remained completely silent. Then Frank, the tall biker with the gray beard, stepped forward. He removed his gloves and placed his hand over his heart. Daniel Wilson, he said firmly, will never ride alone. Behind him, every biker raised a hand in a quiet salute. More than 200 people standing together, honoring a man they had never known. The coffin was slowly lowered into the ground. Margaret held her breath as the final moment arrived. But when it was over, she didn't feel the crushing loneliness she had feared. Instead, she felt surrounded, supported, remembered. As the riders prepared to leave, many of them approached Margaret one by one. Some shook her hand. Others gave her gentle hugs. A few simply nodded respectfully before walking back toward their motorcycles. Finally, Margaret turned toward Keanu again. Her eyes were full of gratitude. I will never forget what you did today, she said softly. Keanu smiled gently. You reminded people how important it is to show up for each other. Margaret nodded slowly. Then she looked back at the riders starting their motorcycles. The deep rumble filled the cemetery once more. But this time, it didn't feel intimidating. It felt comforting. Because that sound meant something powerful. It meant that even in a world where people often feel forgotten, kindness can still bring strangers together. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to listen to create a moment that hundreds will never forget.